everyone, welcome back to On the Flip Side. My name is Adam Shawwalker, your host, and today we're going to be checking out this new album from Kendrick Lamar, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. This is the new, long-awaited 8th studio album from multi-award-winning rapper Kendrick Lamar. I don't really think I need to do much of an introduction for Kenny. There's probably like a 90% chance you at least have a light knowledge of who he is if you're watching this. So we've got this new album, a double album. There's 18 tracks here that really feel like they're fulfilling a promise that Kendrick's last album, Damn, didn't quite deliver on. This album to me feels like a logical addition and development of a lot of the more introspective and self-analyzing moments from To Pimp a Butterfly. And it's nice to see Kendrick stepping back in that direction because he's playing to his strengths, though there are moments here that feel a little bit too on the nose. But still, I also think that some of the songs in this album are new artistic highs for Kendrick. So the consistency ends up being a little bit spotty at points from track to track. You have United in Grief, which is this album's incredibly tight, focused intro track with some incredibly fast lyrical delivery. Kendrick is just spitting bar after bar, and the whole thing acts kind of as a launch pad for this album's main theme, which seems to be focusing in on centering yourself and being at peace with yourself and the world while coming to terms that that peace needs to come from within yourself. This is followed up with N95, which is kind of a clever nod to the N95 masks that have been so frequently talked about and used over the course of the pandemic. And he doesn't really make this into a COVID track, more so he uses a lot of the things that have become more and more common over the past few years as allegories in this metaphorical masking off. This track where he tries to address a lot of the more strained aspects of the general social hierarchy. And I say tries because this song is really dense, and while it does succeed at what it's trying to do to a certain extent, there are some moments where the meaning of the songs is muddied by many of these very heavy overlapping themes. And that's kind of a common occurrence on this album. There has been an incredibly meticulous amount of detail put into these tracks to the point that anything that doesn't quite work begins to stand out a little bit like a sore thumb. But with that being said, that tends to be the biggest flaw for this album, which in my opinion ends up being negligible because as the narrative of this album unfolds, it does a great job pulling you back in regardless of whatever things it might fumble over. Like on Worldwide Steppers, this very self-reflective track that feels like Kendrick is really just getting some stuff off of his chest. He's addressing his absence for the past few years, saying that his relationship with God has helped lift him out of his writer's block. He also talks about several relationships with white women, which he kind of views as a response for the sins of their fathers and as a bit of a retaliation against the systemic oppression of Black Americans over hundreds of years and various other oppressions from all over the world. There are also some fairly trim bars that gently touch on cancel culture and mass responses of outrage, but only as like a convenient way of pushing agendas. And once again, it's bar after bar, verse after verse, more and more themes and ideas are just packed in as tightly as possible. I think Die Hard is one of the few moments on the album that I'm just not like a huge fan of the beat. I think it's a pretty mid track on that end, to be honest, but the lyrics again are very personal. This time focusing in on the uncertainty that comes with opening up to another person and the fear that comes with previous relationships and traumas. At the end of the song, he does seem to come around a bit, realizing that the current relationship is not one based around like disloyalty and is generally much more stable. Father Time is a pretty interesting track on both the lyrical and instrumental side of things with these sweeping piano melodies, rich sample work, and lots of really great switch-ups. Kendrick addresses his own issues with his father and uses his own experiences as an analog for a broad comparison among like Black youth of general mental problems due to the lack of having a father figure. The following tracks, Rich Interlude and Rich Spirit, both are some of my favorite material on the album. The Kodak Black feature here is fantastic, talking about his rise to success and his still present focus on where he came from and how he isn't really adjusted or hasn't really adjusted his responses to a lot of things just because of how ingrained some of these deep traumatic experiences are in his head. I think it's really fresh that some of the biggest rappers in the game are kind of coming together on this album to talk about mental health struggles in marginalized groups. I mean, rap and hip-hop in general have always had a really big struggle with these kinds of topics. It's usually not a genre of sensitivity, or at least historically it hasn't been until very recently, so it's cool to see the stuff really being focused in on instead of shying away from these issues. I think one of the more powerful moments on the album is We Cry Together together, which is pretty much a staged argument between Kendrick and Taylor Page, which is like 5 minutes of just hurling insults at each other. It kind of feels like a bit of like a throwback to the track For Free off of To Pimp a Butterfly, but it's kind of that idea pushed to its most extreme. The energy that they packed into this is really intense. It's not really a very comfortable listen, even with the frankly excellent smooth piano heavy beat. This track just really feels like sitting in a corner quietly and just kind of witnessing some really fucked up shit. The final song on disc 1, Purple Hearts, has a pretty great feature between Summer Walker and Ghostface Killah. I do think the song has a little bit of a tendency to lose its meaning a bit compared to a lot of the other tracks. Thematically, it's a lot more of a spiritual track as far as the lyrics go. I do think it's more so to accommodate the Ghostface Killah feature, which is excellent, though I'm definitely not getting as much of like a concrete theme from this one, but it's still a great track between those features and the beat, which is really well put together. The first track on disc 2, Count Me Out, still feels like it's in line with the narrative of this album, but it seems like a bit of more of a development on the first half of this album. The second half is a lot more moody and has a lot of moments that I would call beautiful. And I think Count Me Out is a good way to kind of ease into that shift. This track tells the story of a relationship that at one point was pretty significant to Kendrick, but he skips through kind of parts of his life talking about how he is now much happier with himself and is glad to know that he is above this person who he clearly did not mesh well with. Crown lyrically is not nearly as complicated as a lot of the other tracks on this album, but is a very solid look into what seems like a combo of Kendrick's usual outlooks on life and his approach to this album. Silent Hill is another track featuring Kodak Black, this time for a kind of mellow trap rap song, but this song to me is kind of one of the only low points on the album, and that is entirely subjective take. To me, it just doesn't feel like this one's bringing all that much to the table, and I think it kind of pretty easily could have been cut. It's really the only track that I would call forgettable in that sense. At the very least, though, I think it does help keep the vibe going. The mindfulness that they took of keeping consistency here was at least like it was there. They knew what to do with this track. Even though I don't really remember it past like a few listens, like, eh. The next couple of tracks, Savior Interlude into Savior, start the final suite of the album that I think dramatically elevates this album above a lot of Kendrick's other work. Baby Keem features on this violin-driven interlude, talking about a lot of experiences that he's gone through, from stuff that happened as a kid to things that have happened a lot more recently, focusing in on the wins and overcoming of some pretty steep odds. The track Savior has a few different angles of approach, a little bit more interesting on that end because they're kind of taking this multifaceted approach to it. The first seems to be that black celebrities, especially black rappers, should not necessarily be figureheads of the black community by default. He also talks about overnight activism and white people with savior complexes, referencing the black profile pictures and screens during the George Floyd protests. And the final angle is that he himself is not necessarily here to be some kind of savior. He has his own problems and is happy to lend support in a disenfranchised community, but instead of championing anything, he's trying to get people to kind of elevate themselves and ultimately help themselves. Anti-Diaries might be one of the most interesting rap tracks ever written from a cultural standpoint. We have one of the biggest artists on earth, one of the biggest, most successful rappers of all time, talking about some transgender relatives. And I don't know if this song is like an invented scenario or not, but the narrative is really interesting because it approaches tolerance from a place of complete ignorance. Hip-hop, for a very long time now, has had a bit of an issue with homophobia, which of course extends into transphobia. So despite the slurs used in this song, I think this track is actually a pretty big step forward in being mindful of people in general in an intersectional way approaching this topic. I think it points to the way the song uses these slurs as tone deaf, but I actually think that adds to the song and emphasizes the point. I think it frames how the issue is still incredibly misunderstood, but it creates an accessible avenue for discussion. Kendrick misgenders and dead names people on the song, which for a lot of people is a pretty damn big no-go, but it contextualizes the level of misunderstanding and how he's trying to connect as best he can and be supportive. And at the end of the song, there's this amazing crescendo where Kendrick wrestles with this concept with his preacher and chooses humanity and humility over the favor of God in a form of acceptance and love for his relatives. He apologizes for saying all of these slurs, and then this family member calls out this comparison to be made between LGBT people being offended with these slurs and how black people get uncomfortable with white people using the N-word, and specifically references a show where Kendrick invited a white girl to sing Mad City with with him on stage where she proceeded to rap the whole thing, dropping the N-word the whole time. So he ends the song with this declaration, you and I, we can all say these things, but you gotta let the white girl say the N-word. Which is just such like it's such a ballsy line, like, I love this track. I wasn't really sure the first few listens, but I mean, shit, it's clever. The title track, Mr. Morale, again, I think is pretty good. It again focuses in on generational trauma. I think this song is more meant to be like a bit of a palate cleanser after the last track. It's a little bit less emotionally deep. I mean, there are still things here and there that are really heavy, but you know, it's got some good bars, good flows. I definitely think this song ends up being a little bit of a fluffer just because of its placement on the album between some incredibly heavy tracks. The second to last track, Mother I Sober with Beth Gibbons from Portishead, is to me far and away the best track on the album. This feels like the artistic peak of the album, like everything else was just kind of a steady incline for this one song, this one moment that is one of the best tracks in his catalog. This track again focuses in on Kendrick's childhood, not necessarily just his experiences in Compton, but the issues that confronted his family as a whole, namely lots of sexual abuse and substance abuse. He then relates these themes to his community on a larger scale and how he hopes these generational curses and cycles of abuse come to an end, and how he is actively breaking this cycle in his own family. He talks about the rampant issues with rape and coping with drugs that seem to affect so many, including most of his contemporaries. Kendrick himself is questioned multiple times in this song by his mother about if his cousin, a known abuser, ever touched him. And he truthfully answers no, but it comes up so often that it still affects him a lot. The way this track approaches this issue is dark. It's a really, really hard topic to put into words, but Kendrick has a really great grasp of how to look at this ugly subject and get some meaning out of it. It's a beautifully grim song that is incredibly powerful. The final song, Mirror, is the outro track for this album. This song really feels like a bit of an ending credits, or like as close as you can get to that in a musical sense. In this track, Kendrick talks about the pressures of people expecting massive contributions and advancements from him, but he doesn't want approval, he just wants to say what he has to say and be happy with his choices. Hence the whole I choose me, I'm sorry line that keeps popping up. And honestly, I think it's a really healthy approach to the current musical landscape. I mean, over the past decade, the gap between artist and listener has become a lot smaller. I mean, you see stuff like Kanye's Instagram or a lot of these rappers and bands on Twitter always involved in some sort of beef. So I really like that he's choosing to keep people at arm's length, because I think he's really deserved that distance. Honestly, I really wish more artists would take that approach. And like I was saying at the beginning of this review, I think that this album is delivering on a promise that Damn did not deliver on. This is the logical next step for Kendrick. There are moments that don't quite go far enough here, but there are certainly none that hold anything back. It kind of reminds me a lot of what people thought was going to happen in 2017 with that whole Damn Nation thing. Like, Damn was released on Good Friday, and people thought that like 3 days later it was supposed to be a double album and Nation would drop on Easter Sunday. Except in this case, we actually got a double album that packed a lot of content and a lot of like really heavy stuff into a relatively neat and concise package. Anyway, this is a good album. One of Kendrick's best in my opinion. I'm really happy that the hype for this one didn't end up killing the quality, so with that being said, I'm thinking this one's a pretty solid 9. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of the album in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe and check out my Instagram, my Reverb, and my Depop. Links to those are in the description below. Thank you all so much again, and we'll see you on the flip side.